No, there was doctors. I can tell you a bit of a sort of bit of joke. The doctors used to do well before Fred was involved, and an on-the-spot diagnosis for diabetes. You know, they did it. The men who were going in the washrooms weren't always careful, and when things dried out, the sugars appeared on their pants. So they called it, provided an on-the-spot diagnosis of diabetes, that sort of thing. It was, yeah, way back in Roman times for sure, and even sir, they recognized it then, because when the patient urinated, flies congregated on the urine because of the sugar.
Or ants.
Sorry?
Or ants.
Yes, yes. Calf pancreas, we went over that a little bit, and that is okay. So you're in Toronto, you've discovered a way of keeping dogs alive by taking the pancreatic extract out of a dog, by taking the pancreas out and extracting it and keeping a dog alive. Well, that's a very inefficient way of running things, because you pretty quickly run out of dogs, and Fred just loved animals. So he was trying, and they were working hard on finding a way of making insulin without using dogs. And they used a lot of dogs. There's a lot of people get upset with that, but that's the way it is. So what happened, he's trying to figure out how to get insulin in large quantities. And the discovery of insulin is really an idea in London, the revelation of using the dogs in Toronto with Best, and then they discovered a way of making it in bulk. You know how it was? They decided that Fred realized from his experience on the farm that the calves, the unborn calves, had a pancreas that's unused. So he goes into the abattoirs in Toronto, shocks the dickens out of the abattoir runners, because he went out with a basket full of calf pancreas. We call them sweetbreads, right? Took them back to the lab and turned into insulin. And lucky for him, he made the right choice, because any other animal would have been a killer. It just turned out that the cow pancreas and the human, very close match. So for years and years, early on in the treatment of diabetes, the solution was, the insulin was cow and calf livers and so on. Then there was a guy by the name of Joe Gilchrist. Sooner or later, I will find him. Joe Gilchrist was a family friend. He was in the war, so Fred knew him. He was in the same class as Fred, and then he became diabetic. And he recognized that Fred was working on this stuff, and maybe there's a chance. He stumbles into Fred's lab with Best and volunteers to become a guinea pig. Because what better results are you going to get from a doctor who's diabetic? Give you the exact symptoms, treatment, reactions, the whole bit. So Gilchrist is involved. Fred's going back and forth to home. He's working out ways of extracting insulin. He's overwhelmed by the number of people wanting insulin, and they can't produce it fast enough or test it properly. Like, all of a sudden there's an insulin panic. There's a drought of insulin. And so Gilchrist arrives on the scene, and Fred and Best are experimenting on him. So they test one another. Best gets a shot, Banting gets a shot. They're looking at one another saying, yep, we're still alive. Then Joe comes along, and they talks them into a surreptitious test. Not in any of the books, Because it's only a family story, because some people say it can't possibly be. Bliss says no. I say no. Anyway, the surreptitious test was they tested insulin on Gilchrist before they tested Leonard Thompson. That's the family thinking. And so as a result, the story goes this way. Fred has Gilchrist on a bench in the lab, and they're testing him using a Douglas bag. It's the way they test for carbohydrates or carbon dioxide. And Gilchrist would breathe into this bag, and what they were doing is modeling how much they injected of insulin into Gilchrist versus how much they were using on the dogs. And what Gilchrist was doing was lying there. The dogs would get up and run around and be active, and so the insulin under the skin would mix in quickly. On the other hand, Gilchrist was lying and no reactions yet. So what happened is they gave him the shot and no reaction. Fred was disappointed. He didn't think it was going to work on humans. He decided he was going to go home. He jumps the train to Alliston. And so he's on his way home. And Best is still trying to do some tests on Gilchrist in the lab. Still not working. They give him another shot. Still not working. No positive results. Still showing all the symptoms of diabetes. So what happens, according to my father and my uncle and my aunts, passing the story down, Gilchrist decides to walk, there's a Dr. Joseph Gilchrist, decides to walk home, 4 or 5 blocks. He normally would walk along the sidewalk in Toronto, dragging off, he was so weak. And he would get to the stairs where he roomed, and take the stairs one step at a time, according to my father. He would pick his leg up and put it on the next step. And his aunt, who he was staying with, knew he was coming because that's the sound of him coming upstairs. As he was going home, walking that few blocks home from the lab, he recognized that there was a surge of energy coming into it. He didn't realize what it was. He didn't realize what was going on. His aunt knew it was something going on because he took the stairs one at a time. Boom, 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 boom. Picked up his niece and nephew, and she recognized there was something wrong. He turned around and went back to the lab, and Best is sitting there saying, it didn't work, right? He walked in, bubbling away, right? Gilchrist comes in, and Best knew right away, like the symptoms have changed. Guess where Fred is? He's on the train to Alliston. So to get the story right, we've gone back and made sure that there was a telephone in the farm at the time. What did Best do? He telephones Fred. So Fred gets, and the family get this news about Joe Gilchrist over the telephone that's supplied from the Hippo drugstore in Alliston. Interesting, huh? Questions?
Did he survive for very long?
Gilchrist? Yep. And he did a lot of work on patients thereafter. He treated diabetics. Wrote several books on it. Yeah, very much so.
How old was Gilchrist at the time?
He was older than Fred, and so that would make him like 32 or so. Anybody interested in genealogy, DNA, that sort of thing? Does anybody do that? Yeah, we know what you're doing on winter nights, right? Yeah, no, it's interesting to try and track down all the genealogy. We had a gentleman by the name of my uncle, Edward Banting, did all the classical genealogy, went to all the places that you go to churches, the thing. And he found little traces that we've now extended. For example, Fred was United Empire Loyalist. Who knew? Like, the whole bunch of them come from around the Albion area and moved up. And there's a teeny little graveyard in the Albion spot for the great-grandfather. We didn't think there was a hope that that was really a true story until we did DNA. And what pops out? But a relative of that side, the Luthers, show up as being a member of the Fred's loyalist group. So you can start and trust some of this DNA. I know you know a gentleman in Alliston by the name of Garnet Medill. He's helping me a little bit here and there. He did DNA, okay, and he comes from Ireland, okay. So do we, but we can't find where. So there's a brick wall there. But lo and behold, he did the test, and I'm going through mine and saying, what is that person over there doing? Lo and behold, he and I knew one another for years and years, like working on the homestead and so on. This is 25 years now, practically. We're related. Not just like a couple, like third cousins. Didn't know it. I want to tell you the story in the sabotage story. Fred Banting was killed in a wreck of a Lockheed Hudson aircraft, a bomber aircraft, in near Musgrave Harbor, Newfoundland. They took off from what was the Newfoundland airport then, and then Gander, on a Friday night. They got out over the ocean, one engine failed, and the pilot Mackey turned the plane around, the bomber. Fred was aboard because he was going to England to do research on aviation chemistry. They were actually doing experiments over Rice Lake and how to distribute biological material, the bad stuff. We won't talk about that too much. Anyway, he was on his way over there on this bomb, as a passenger on the bomber. They turned the plane, the pilot turned the plane around, got it within sight of shore, and the second engine failed. He coasted over a ridge and ended up almost landing without any difficulties, wheels up, on a frozen lake, which is now called Banting Lake. Neat. They renamed it. It was called 7 Mile Pond, but the local people renamed it to Banting Lake. He almost made it, because if it wasn't for the biggest tree in Newfoundland, as they came over the ridge, the left wing, or stay away from the nautical, hit a bid on this big tree, and it rotated the plane like a pivot, like you'd go around a turnstile, and it went smashed into the bush on the edge of the shore. The sudden stop killed the navigator, who was ready to jump with a parachute, and it also killed the radio man, who was unfortunately smashed into the radio gear. But Fred survived. He survived by bracing himself on a bulkhead. They had a little bunk that he was sitting on, and he survived the crash and lived for 2 or 3 days with a bit of help from Mackey, the pilot. But why did the plane come down in the first place? Because the other 5 that left at the same time landed in Ireland with no troubles, no gas issues, no issues at all. What happened to this one? Well, there's lots of speculation, but the fact is, the untold story is there was sand in the oil. And how do you get sand in the oil of an aircraft like that? Any ashtray, any spark plug cleaning device in the airport would allow them to get a handful of sand and put that sand in both tanks, left and right tanks, the tanks they're running on, the wing tanks. And the odd part is that the engine would gum up not because of sand in the pistons and so on, but because the oil flow stopped to the engine. Now there are people who believe it was because the oil coolers were changed out, and there went from, Bliss says it, a square oil cooler to a round, or there was no such thing as a square oil cooler. They were all round, always. And what was going on is when Mackey, the pilot, tried to feather the motors, because it would have glided back to the airport if they had been able to feather the motors, both engines gone. Both engines were windmilling, so the prop was trying to turn against Normally feathering puts it at right angles to the slipstream. The props were right angled trying to revolve. And the vibration caused different things. They were throwing out everything. They threw out a whole case of oranges that they were taking over to England to Mackey's friends. But the bottom line is, Mackey came back to Newfoundland about 20 years later to thank the rabbit hunters from pulling him out of the bush on a slide and take him into a nurse who saved his life. And he gave them all hunting knives. While he was back, he said, for sure, during the war, nobody was going to say yes or no on what was going on with that, the story of behind the crash. But now, we can clearly come up back and say, it was the biggest cover-up we've ever had in Canada, and that is, someone put Fred Banting on a Hudson aircraft, right? Put him in a spot in Gander where there was no protection at all, no fences, no security, zero. They were not guarded at night. At night, the planes were moved in and out of the hangars. There were people that didn't know. And believe it or not, there's a German connection to that airport. Just before the war started, the Germans had sold Newfoundland a blind landing system. It's used, new electronic ones are used all the time now. But Telefunken sold Newfoundland, not part of Canada, a blind landing system. And those people got trapped in Newfoundland. There's a pretty good chance that they were at Gander or the Newfoundland airport. But the bottom line is, I got proof positive, spent all kinds of time on knowing the sabotage story. There's a whole book on it, the Banting Enigma. There's proof positive, really, that no one wanted to tell anyone. We just lost Canada's #1 soldier. He was a major. Nobel Prize laureate. A scientist that was doing all kinds of research on things that would shorten the war. All kinds of money raising. He had what they call a Santa Claus fund. Because of the insulin background, the people with money in Canada and Montreal and Toronto, like the Seagram family, they gave him money. And they called it the Santa Claus fund. They gave him money because he had a habit, a reputation of making things happen. So there's the fact of the matter is, my father said it, my grandfather said it, Thompson said it, Bliss said it, is now being able to, in the book, starting to believe it, that Fred was killed by sabotage. Questions?
If you read about it, that plane went down, I've read it someplace, and I thought it was the coast of England.
Nope. Newfoundland, about 10 miles from Musgrave Harbor. They call it the Straight Shore. They have a wonderful park there called the Banting Water Park, I guess. I can't remember the exact name. And it just so happens that the plane overflew that section of the shore to get back, to make the turn, to come back. Yeah, so that was the, in today's day, Fred would have survived. There's a lot of speculation too about how he died.
How old was he? 49, was it?
He was in his 49th year.
The way
Well, that's
I read
speculation.
about it, he died in mysterious circumstances on a flight off the coast of England. I can still read that.
You need another book. I've never heard that story. The questions? More questions on the sabotage story?
Was he not working on some sort of flight survival suit?
Yep. One of the things was aviation medicine. One of many things they're working on. Like he and a fellow who was working for him by the name of Franks, William Franks, I think, were working on a suit that the pilot could put on that when they're in a Spitfire and did a quick turn, what would happen was all the blood in their head would go to their feet and they'd black out, they'd just go white. And so the Spitfire, physically, the plane could make a turn, but the pilot wasn't going to be around to straighten it out. And so they were working on this suit. They did, and he was taking the suit not in the airplane, but the suit was going by ship, and he was going to be over in England with the suit, called the Frank's flight suit. It was made, it was an unusual thing because it was not like the flight suits today. It was, they're pressurized by air, and these were pressurized by water. So they had basically inner tubes, you know, that sort of thing, down the legs of the pilot suit. And there's a family story that goes with that. There's Fred trying to test this out, right, in the lab in Toronto. In the Banting Institute, there wasn't a bathtub big enough to test the whole suit, so in case it was leaking. So he had a friend across the way that was in an apartment. So what did he do? He and Franks walk across University Avenue with a flight suit, end up in the apartment, and these two grown scientists are in the bathroom playing in the bathtub, according to the daughter. So that's a well-written, documented story, that is. She couldn't figure out what was going on in the bathroom with Fred and Franks, but they were testing for leaks in one of these flight suits. Yeah, the flight suit. The other one that not a lot of people talk about is, I don't like to get into it much either, is that Fred had decided, because he was subjected to it in the Great War, he had decided that if we didn't have the ability to throw back on Germany germ warfare, then they were going to use it. And he expected to have a deterrent that would be significant enough to discourage them from doing it. And they did. They had a whole lab set up to produce different bad things that would be bad to you, including, like I said earlier, a little flight trip over Rice Lake where they're figuring out how they could drop this stuff out the back of a plane and have it distributed on the water so it would flow into the shore and people would pick it up.
How did they actually make the insulin? I seem to remember that the story about Banting going to the abattoir to pick up animal parts. Now, but it's artificial insulin, is it not now?
Yeah.
Okay, and what was the lab, the name of the lab?
Connaught Laboratory.
Connaught Labs, thank you.
Connaught Labs in
Yeah,
Toronto.
and was it not Banting who said that nobody could make money from, that nobody could own the patent or whatever it was, that it was a sort of
Banting-
humanitarian sort of
Banting
thing?
decided that it would be inappropriate for anybody to profit by
Yeah, that's
having
what I
the
read.
patent,
Yeah.
owning the patent for insulin. So he
Yeah.
refused.
Yeah.
I have the records. He refused to take a job at the Rockefeller Institute, like in today's dollars, multi-million-dollar salary, big, elegant lab, turned it away. He wanted to make sure that insulin was available to people like Jenny Victoria Jordan at the cost. And he did. He succeeded at that. Early insulin was made from cow and calf pancreas.
Yeah.
Later insulins, as we know it, like took about, well, it was 40 years before they got it from
The artificial.
artificial.
Yeah.
And some of the diabetics don't like the artificial.
Where does the step from the cow to the monkey come in? Because at Connaught Laboratory, they use the rhesus monkey, I think.
I don't know of any monkeys that were involved in Connaught research. It was dogs, rabbits. I don't know of any monkeys, to my knowledge.
Okay.
There was quite a bit of competition too, was there not? Connaught with the insulin, weren't there American scientists working on it as well, wasn't there?
No, they weren't until suddenly there was this discovery.
Okay,
And then all of a sudden it started.
okay.
And
So
at
it was the
that point,
actual serum then that was competition for, the actual insulin?
the production
Yeah.
and the distribution and the fact that everybody in the world at the time knew somebody that was diabetic, just like we do now.
Yeah.
And there was a drive to get it. He had people begging him, like he could have got any kind of money
Yeah.
for a vial of insulin. And he had to pick and choose because some of them died. Sad part of it. Have I warned everybody else up? Is my time up?
So if you had a book to recommend about Sugar Uncle, what would you recommend?
The Bliss books?
Yeah, I read this book. I thought maybe he was a little critical.
Yes.
Yeah,
Just a teeny bit.
yeah. It was
A
sort of
little
like-
bit of an exaggeration at times. He knew how to sell books. So when he wrote history, the good part is he did. So there's a history book. The negative part of it, because if you know the history like I do, what the family does, you know that some of these stories are a little bit stretched. Like, you know, like, and he would write off things like this story. They're testing the flight suit, right? Okay, how do you test the flight suit? You get up in get a pilot up in an airplane and you fly it, and you do loops and so on. Guess who's in the plane with the pilot in Trenton? Fred. You know, this guy was capable of doing anything, and he couldn't. The pilot knew the old guy in the back of the plane. They were told not to make any rough, abrupt turns. And Fred is saying, "Please, you know." Bill Banting, who I knew quite well, Fred's son, had a story that really set the example of how powerful his father really was. It drove the whole story home. That is, one day, Fred comes home and says, "Do you want to see a really fast plane?" You know, to his son. And if you do, get out behind your schoolyard, which was near where they lived in Toronto, and be there at noon. And so Fred, and never do it today, never ever. Fred talked the pilot, it's well documented, to doing a flyover of that part of Toronto and the school. So what did Bill do? He got up and said, "Oh boy, I'm going to be the hero." He got all of his friends. Yeah. Guess what? We're going to see a fast plane come over, and it's going to come from right over there. He knew exactly where it was going to come from. So this whole crowd of kids were just from Bill. All of Bill's friends. Ooh. The souped-up Spitfire that they were using in the testing for the flight suit went over, right over the treetops, right over the school. Can you imagine that happening today? The lawsuits would be wild. Can you imagine testing insulin today the way they test it? Okay, Gilchrist, we'll give you a shot. You don't know what's going to happen. In fact, that's why it was so surreptitious. There's some thinking that they were worried that, God help us, what would happen if it killed Joe, you know? But they tested it on themselves. They tested it on Marjorie. Poor Marjorie. A longevity dog. She lived 70 days on insulin and proved once and for all that it worked. They had, the other people that are involved in beyond Charlie Best and Fred were two people. Collip, who should be well recognized as being the person who purified insulin. He got the bad stuff on it. Because when they were first giving the shots, it raised a welt wherever it was injected because of the impurities in it. But the person was well, just had a welt. So Collip worked with rabbits on purifying insulin. A great deal of chemical work on making it pure. Then there was McLeod. And in the family, I'm not so happy about McLeod because he was in Edinburgh when the discovery was made. He, according to family lore, thought that Banting would fail. And hence he gave him exactly what he asked for. He gave him a lab for 10 dogs, and I think it was 14 weeks. That was it. That's exactly what he gave him, and no more, no less. And lo and behold, he went on vacation. So when all of this discovery occurred, Fred was, a farmer. He wasn't used to doing any public speaking. And so he had to get up amongst the cognoscenti and start telling them how this was working. Well, he wasn't good at it. So McLeod got into this part of it because that was his business. and he was recognized for being the person that had the lab. So what? So McLeod shared the Nobel Prize, largely because he was a good documenter and a good presenter. Didn't really help. In fact, he gave Fred and Best a bum steer, and that was, he told them that he could do a certain surgery and tie up the pancreas ducts with catgut, and that was wrong, because it didn't work. So Fred did his own method and it worked. Any questions?
That is like McLeod.
Sorry?
They spelled McLeod who gave the lab.
John J. Rickards McLeod.
Yeah. Was he Best first recognized and then Best somehow said, no, Banting said Best has to be within, or something like that?
Banting and Best were awarded the Nobel Prize together.
Yeah.
Banting was absolutely furious that Best was not recognized. He darn near crashed his car trying to get back to the university consulate in Toronto to try and object to this, because initially he was not going to go to pick up the Nobel Prize. And he didn't go until 1925. He was awarded in 23. He didn't go and do the Nobel Prize presentation until 25. He objected strenuously that Best was not recognized. And so he shared half of his prize, with Best. And that forced McLeod to share half of his prize with Collin. So they were all sort of recognized by default, but the two prime, on the certificate and the medal, which I've held, it's McLeod and Banting. The medal, by the way, I've held it, it's a two-hander, solid gold, you know, it's interesting to hang on to. Canada's first.
Where
Other
is it
questions?
now? Where is it now?
It's in safekeeping in a vault, the University of Toronto Fisher Research Library on Harvard Street, Toronto. Along with all the rest of the files that Bliss used to produce that book. More questions?